My name is David Burse, and I am the new head of the International Affairs Department at the George Bush School of Government and Public Service. And I am here tonight on behalf of Andrew Natsios, who is the director of the Scowcroft Institute for International Affairs. And he's not able to be here tonight for personal reasons, but he asked me to open with an apology. Tonight at sunset, Yom Kippur, the holiest of Jewish holidays, will begin. And we should not have scheduled this event on this day. So I want to apologize for this mistake and promise that we will not let something like this happen again. Having offered an apology, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Richard Joe Golson, who is a university distinguished professor, now in my department, International Affairs, but formerly in the French department. He is also a Scowcroft Senior Fellow, and he is the director of the France Texas A&M Institute. He's previously professor at Case Western Reserve and a visiting professor at the University of Paris. In addition, he has been awarded academic palms by the French government. Tonight, Professor Golson will talk about his new book published by the University of Toronto Press this year, titled Justice in Lyon, Klaus Barbie and France's First Trial for Crimes Against Humanity. So I would like to introduce today's author, Professor Golson.
Thank you, David. It's a real pleasure to see all of you all here tonight. I'm delighted to see students and colleagues and friends. And I thought I'd want to thank a few people before we begin. First of all, Andrew Natsios, who's been wonderfully supportive, in fact, of this very project. Also, Monica Holder and Cassandra Meduzia, who are the staff at the Scowcroft Institute, and the undergraduate student worker for the France TAMU Institute who put together this collage of photos. I'll be talking about these people as I go through my text, so I thought it'd be helpful for you all to see them as I'm talking about it, and then perhaps afterwards I can tell you a few more things about several of them. Okay. Perhaps more than any other Western European nation aside from Germany, France has been haunted by the legacies and memories of its World War II past, what the French refer to simply as the dark years. Beginning in the 1970s and following the death of its president and wartime hero, Charles de Gaulle, the French have in many ways been suffering from a long-term psychological and cultural malady that Henry Rousseau famously labeled the Vichy syndrome. The Vichy syndrome, named for the capital of France's collaborationist and pro-German wartime government, manifests itself in periodic scandals and controversies that challenge and indeed debunk the myth that during the war, France was a nation of resistors opposed to the collaborationist Vichy regime, its Nazi overlords, and the murderous anti-Semitism of the Nazis that led to the Holocaust. The realities of wartime France were in fact quite different. Humiliated and traumatized by the catastrophic defeat of the French army in May-June 1940, most French welcomed the return of stability represented by the Vichy regime, even at the cost of the regime's total subservience to the Nazis. That subservience led, among other things, to a willing participation in the roundup and deportation of tens of thousands of French and foreign Jews to the death camps in the East. In the end, some 76,000 Jews from France died in the Holocaust. That figure does not include Jews tortured and killed within France by Nazi police and their French minions. Of these Nazi police forces, the most feared and brutal was the Gestapo, which set up headquarters in cities and towns across occupied France. The mission of the Gestapo was to suppress the resistance and help implement Hitler's final solution of the Jewish question, aka the Holocaust, throughout the occupied country. Of these Gestapo policemen, none was more feared and hated than SS Lieutenant Klaus Barbie, head of the Gestapo in the beautiful central French city of Lyon. Between his arrival in Lyon in November 1942 and his departure with the liberation of the city by the Allies in late summer 1944, Klaus Barbie visited a reign of terror on the city and the surrounding region. He tortured, murdered, and deported literally thousands of Jews and resistance fighters, including men, women, and children. His methods, brutal in the extreme, earned him the nickname the Butcher of Lyon. Among his most notorious crimes, in April 1944, Barbie oversaw the arrest and deportation of 43 Jewish children and their teachers from a school in which they were hidden in the tiny hamlet of Isieux, located some 30 miles from Lyon. All the children died in deportation. Of the crimes against humanity for which Barbie was tried some 40 years later, the deportation to their deaths of these innocent children was the most horrific. In one of the trial's most powerful moments, the lawyer representing the interests of the Isieux children at the trial, the famed Nazi hunter Serge Klarsfeld, began his closing statement to the court by simply reading out their names and their ages. The effect on the enormous courtroom was overwhelming. The silence was complete. Like many Nazi sadists and killers, Klaus Barbie did not start out that way. Born in Bad Godesberg, Germany in 1913, Barbie's parents were both school teachers. His father fought for the German army during the entirety of World War I. Gravely wounded in the neck, Barbie's father lived in pain for the rest of his life. He became a serious alcoholic, prone to violence, and was known to beat his wife and 2 sons regularly. As a child, Barbie was well liked by his classmates and neighbors who called him Sonny. Devoutly Catholic, Barbie worked for Christian charity organizations helping indigent peoples. He would later write about his sympathy for them. During his trial decades later, the chief prosecutor in Lyon, Pierre Truche, asked how such an empathetic young man had become a Nazi henchman. Barbie refused to answer. Whatever his youthful qualities, once in the SS and then the Gestapo, Barbie revealed other dimensions of his character. One of his American handlers, when Barbie worked for U.S. Army intelligence after the war, described him as a Nazi idealist. Adept at spying on and betraying others to his Nazi superiors, Barbie showed no qualms about brutalizing and killing men, women, and children. After arresting France's greatest resistance hero, Jean Moulin, Barbie beat him to within an inch of his life. Deported to Germany after his encounter with Barbie, Moulin died of his wounds before he ever got out of France. Neither during his 1987 trial nor during his 4 years of captivity in France before the trial began did Barbie show any remorse for his actions. He never would. As the Allies swept across France in summer 1944, Barbie fled back to Germany, but not before organizing a final deportation train loaded with 800 Jews and captured resistance fighters. Most never returned to France. Hiding out after the war in a defeated, divided, and occupied Germany, Barbie adopted a number of aliases and received aid and support from a secret network of fellow SS members. Eventually, through a friend, Barbie went to work for the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps. He was assigned, ironically, to spy on the French. Although the French were allies, the Cold War had begun, and American intelligence feared that French intelligence and security services were thoroughly infiltrated by communists. Barbie's American employers respected his talents, although it remains unclear how effective Barbie was as a spy. Under any circumstances, by 1951, Barbie's presence in the American sector of Germany and his ties to American intelligence were known to the French. Fearing a diplomatic incident, American authorities decided to get Barbie and his family out of Germany and Europe by sending them down the famous Rat Line, a network set up with right-wing elements in the Catholic Church and the International Red Cross to help Nazis escape to South America. That same year, Klaus Barbie, now known as Klaus Altmann, sailed for South America with his wife and 2 young children. Unlike many of his fellow Nazis, Barbie did not settle in Argentina, where he initially landed. He moved on to Bolivia. There he went to work for a Jewish sawmill operator. He eventually bought out his employer and over the years built a small fortune through a combination of legitimate and illegitimate business practices. Among the latter were confidence schemes, drug trading, and arms dealing. As many who encountered Barbie in South America affirmed, he never wavered in his Nazi beliefs, his hatred of Jews, and his absolute loyalty to Hitler. Given his skills in political repression and interrogation, Barbie served as an advisor to several right-wing Bolivian dictatorships. In appreciation for his service, Barbie was made an honorary colonel in the Bolivian army. When his whereabouts and true identity were revealed in the early 1970s, the international community clamored for his expatriation and demanded that he be tried and punished for his wartime crimes. Protected by Bolivian dictators, Barbie lived on openly and with impunity in La Paz. Reveling in his international notoriety, he gave multiple interviews over several years to the international press. For these interviews, Barbie insisted on being paid handsomely. In 1983, Klaus Barbie's luck ran out. A left-wing democratic government came to power in Bolivia. The new government negotiated with the French government to expel Barbie, whose notoriety and impunity in Bolivia had become an international embarrassment for that country. In February 1983, Barbie was arrested for failure to pay the Bolivian government money he owed. Then, under the cover of night, he was taken to the airport and flown to French Guiana, where he was handed over to French authorities. When he realized he was in French hands, he claimed German citizenship that he no longer possessed and demanded to be sent to Germany. Instead, he was flown to Lyon. There, he was briefly and symbolically imprisoned in a now empty Montluc prison, where he had kept Jews and resistors under horrific conditions during the war. Then he was transferred to Lyon's main prison, where he remained for 4 years while his case was being investigated and numerous legal obstacles to bringing him to trial were dealt with. Barbie finally faced the Lyon Assize Court for his crimes against humanity in May 1987. During the time Barbie waited in prison, debate and controversy swirled around the legal, moral, and historical issues that inevitably arose over a case like his and the historical magnitude of the trial that was about to take place. For some, it was simply too late to try Barbie for his wartime crimes. More than 40 years had passed. Barbie was now a sickly old man whose wife and son had recently died. Perhaps some argue naively he had repented his crimes. For others, the trial that was planned was too expensive and out of all proportion with the stature of the accused. Barbie, after all, was just a Nazi thug. Interviewed in the press, the resistance hero Jean Moulin's former wife created a stir when she stated that Barbie deserved nothing better than to be shot and forgotten. While these concerns were ultimately matters of personal opinion, the legal and historical issues surrounding the trial were not. In French law, the statute of limitations runs out on war crimes after 20 years. More than 40 years had passed since the war ended, so Barbie could not be charged with war crimes. Besides, Barbie had already been tried in absentia for many of these war crimes in 1952 and 54 by French military tribunals, so he could not be tried again for them without violating a fundamental legal principle according to which one cannot be tried for the same crime twice. That meant that Barbie could only be tried for crimes against humanity, which in French law have no statute of limitations. But charging Barbie with crimes against humanity created its own set of problems with which the court and the French legal system would have to contend. First, crimes against humanity were only incorporated into French law in 1964. If then Barbie were to be charged with crimes against humanity in 1987, this would appear to violate another fundamental principle of international law, which is that there is no crime committed if there is no law on the books at the time to define it as such. This had been a problem at Nuremberg when crimes against humanity were first applied, and now the same problem was arising in the French court. For some, this very fact compromised the legitimacy of the Barbie trial in advance, as it had Nuremberg. As if this were not problematic enough, there was another complication that the French Supreme Court would ultimately have to resolve. Since Nuremberg, crimes against humanity in international law had only applied to racial, ethnic, and other minorities who were targeted and victimized simply for being who they were. Crimes against humanity did not apply to enemy combatants, against whom only war crimes could be committed. In Barbie's case, this meant that Barbie could only be tried for crimes committed against his Jewish victims, not his resistance victims. Given that there were many hundreds of the latter, and that Barbie was best remembered in France for torturing the resistance hero Jean Moulin to death, what kind of justice could be rendered if crimes committed against half of Barbie's victims were not included in the charges against him? A partial one at best, many argued. On the other hand, if French law allowed resistance victims to be included among Barbie's crimes against humanity, this would fundamentally alter the jurisprudence established at Nuremberg and blur the distinction that separated the ethnic victims of a regime like Nazi Germany from those who actively opposed its hegemony. In legal terms, this would obscure the key element of Nazism that made it a fundamentally criminal ideology, its murderous racism and anti-Semitism. Finally, in 1985, 2 years after Barbie's arrest and imprisonment, the French Supreme Court made its decision on this vexed matter. Essentially, the court rewrote the definition of crimes against humanity in French law so that some of Barbie's resistance victims could be included in the charges of crimes against humanity pending against him. While this resolved the matter in the moment and allowed plans for the trial itself to proceed, it would be up to the Lyon Assize Court, where Barbie would be tried, to somehow validate this decision in human terms. This was one of the fundamental challenges of the Barbie trial. As the Barbie trial finally was about to open in mid-May 1987 in the newly reconstructed and enlarged courtroom, intended to accommodate hundreds of journalists and other observers from France and around the world, the atmosphere in the city was tense. A makeshift memorial to Barbie's victims, set up in a public square, drew thousands daily. At the same time, however, neo-Nazi protesters and Holocaust deniers paraded in the streets. To ward off any threat of violence, police snipers were placed on the roof of the Palace of Justice, where the trial would take place, as well as on the roofs of surrounding buildings. On the afternoon of May 11th, the trial began. Seated in the front of the court were the president of the Assize Court, the equivalent of a judge in an American criminal trial, his two assistant judges. Arrayed alongside the three judges were 9 jurors. In the French system, the 3 judges deliberate and vote with the jurors, and the verdict reached does not have to be unanimous. To the left of the judges and jury were Barbie's defense counsel, and to the right, the prosecutor and the so-called civil parties lawyers. In a French criminal trial, the victims of the accused have the right not only to address the court, they can also hire lawyers to represent their interests. In the Barbie trial, there were some 40 civil parties lawyers, all of whom had the right to interrogate witnesses in the accused and to make closing statements. This explains one of the oddities of the Barbie trial, which led many foreign observers to dismiss the trial itself as monotonous and boring, which was that the last 2 weeks of the Barbie trial were given over entirely to closing statements by defense lawyers, civil parties lawyers, and the state prosecutor. Some of those closing statements were powerful and compelling, some meandering and confusing. But aside from the occasional long-windedness of lawyers, the Barbie trial was anything but boring. The most dramatic moment of the opening of the trial was the initial appearance of the accused himself in the courtroom. Given the enormity of Barbie's crimes, journalists wrote that the audience were expecting the entrance of a terrifying quasi-demonic creature, even if it was a man of Barbie's age. Instead of this frightening apparition, the person who entered the court was a shrunken old man, badly in need of a haircut and wearing a suit that seemed to swallow him up. Barbie greeted his lawyers and the translator seated next to him politely. He seemed almost kindly. As the trial got underway, Klaus Barbie's initially benign, avuncular demeanor gave way to a cold, mocking presence that only intensified as victim after victim recounted the horrors experienced at his hands. Barbie remained impassive as some victims broke down on the stand. Others, noting his presence in the box, confronted him angrily. For some of the victims, the experience of testifying was simply too much. Some were hospitalized after their testimony. One of those who confronted Barbie about his crimes in the courtroom, visibly drained by the experience, died within a few weeks of the conclusion of the Barbie trial. In the French system, as part of the investigation of the crimes of the accused, victims and witnesses are confronted with the accused in prison before the trial begins in order to identify him. In Barbie's case, the records of the investigation reveal that many of these victims and witnesses experienced the same fear and indeed terror in seeing the old man in the 1980s as they had in encountering the young Barbie in wartime France. Given the option to testify at the trial itself, several declined. They simply could not overcome their fear. But this is not to suggest that Barbie's mere presence in the box cowed all of his victims who testified at the trial. Quite the reverse. If, as the French historian Annette Riviocca has written, since the trial of Adolf Eichmann, all historical trials had become part of what she calls the era of the witness, the Barbie trial was no exception. In fact, the Barbie trial is best remembered for the compelling and deeply moving testimony of some of Barbie's victims, and female victims in particular. Two of the latter were particularly memorable. Lise Lesevre, a former resistance member, was in her 70s at the time of the trial. When called to testify, she approached the witness stand with great difficulty, leaning on a cane. She explained to the court that Barbie had shattered her spine with a mace during one of her many brutal interrogations. Because Lesevre refused to divulge the names of her resistance superiors, Barbie arrested her son and her husband. Both were deported and would later die in deportation. Lesevre herself was eventually deported. She only kept track of the many camps she was sent to by writing down their locations on scraps of paper she kept in her shoe. Another of Barbie's victims, Simone Kadosh Lagrange, was a 13-year-old girl of Jewish Moroccan descent when she was arrested along with her parents on D-Day. When the family first encountered Barbie, he was polite and reassuring. But when her parents could not tell Barbie where their other children were hidden, in fact, they didn't know, he became violent. He grabbed Simone Kadosh by her long hair, flung her to the ground, and struck her. "See what you are making me do to your daughter," he said. For the next few weeks, mother and daughter were kept in Montluc prison. Each day, Barbie came to get the young Simone, took her away to be interrogated and tortured. And when he returned to her cell, he repeated his question to her mother, "See what you've made me do to your daughter." Simone Kadosh Lagrange's mother later died at Auschwitz. When Simone herself was deported, she saw her father shot to death in front of her. If the testimony of the witness victims like Lise Lesevre and Simone Kadosh Lagrange served to dispel any illusion that the old man in the box deserved any sympathy or forgiveness, which of course Barbie never asked for, the testimony of Lise Lesevre in particular accomplished something equally important for the trial. I stated earlier that the controversial decision by the French Supreme Court to include resistance victims as victims of Barbie's crimes against humanity weighed on the Barbie trial from the outset. One of those resistance victims was Lise Lesevre. Lesevre had been an enemy combatant, and she had been arrested as such. If she had not been in the resistance, her family would not have been automatically targeted by the Nazis, as had Kadosh Lagrange's family. But what Lesevre had suffered was unspeakable and surpassed any traditional definition of a war crime. As the chief prosecutor, Pierre Truche, later affirmed, there are degrees of crimes against humanity. Anyone who is targeted to die simply for being born what they are, a Jew, for example, stands above the rest. But as Lise Lesevre's case demonstrated, there are other victims, and not just racial and ethnic victims, who can also fairly and reasonably be described as victims of crimes against humanity. If the Barbie trial was obliged to deal with fundamental issues in international law, such as the definition and meaning of crimes against humanity, thanks to the defense presented by Barbie's lawyers, it was obliged to deal with historical issues of global import as well. The Israeli legal historian Lior Bilski has written that all great historic trials, from Nuremberg to the Eichmann trial, ultimately center on a clash of historical worldviews, and the Barbie trial was no exception. Rather than focus primarily on refuting the charges against the accused, Barbie's lawyer, Jacques Vergès, sought instead to turn the tables and make the trial about the crimes of the accusers, not the accused. Vergès labeled this tactic a trial by rupture. In defending his client, Vergès repeatedly insisted on a vision of modern history which had the effect of diminishing Nazi crimes to the point of insignificance. What were Nazi crimes, he asked the court, when compared to the centuries of crimes, colonial and otherwise, of white Europeans, the United States, and more recently Israel? What was the difference ultimately between a Jew who died in the ghetto or in the gas chamber, and an Algerian tortured to death by French paratroopers during the Algerian War, or a Palestinian killed by Israeli police, or a Vietnamese peasant killed at My Lai by American troops? Given the centuries of colonial oppression in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere, the crimes of the Nazis, including the Holocaust, were just a drop in the ocean of human suffering of no special significance at all. Therefore, Vergès urged the court and jury to acquit Barbie. Only in this way could France and the French overcome their own hypocrisy in trying the likes of Klaus Barbie while ignoring their own past crimes in Algeria and elsewhere. It is important to stress that while Jacques Vergès' defense of his client might seem extreme and unpersuasive in legal terms, Vergès was no crackpot lawyer. In fact, by the time of the Barbie trial, Vergès was well known internationally as a maverick and defender of controversial clients, including Algerian terrorists, members of Germany's Baader-Meinhof gang, and even the world-famous terrorist Carlos. He would later provide legal counsel to the likes of Serbian strongman Slobodan Milosevic and Saddam Hussein. Moreover, Vergès was formidable in the courtroom itself. Mocking and insulting witnesses and opposing lawyers alike, the defense lawyer's mere presence was unsettling and disruptive. To further unsettle the court and to drive home the point that Barbie's defense was in fact the defense of oppressed and colonized people everywhere, Vergès employed two additional lawyers representing two former European colonial possessions. One was Algerian, the other was Congolese. In their closing statements, neither of these lawyers said one word about Barbie's crimes, honing in instead on European and Israeli crimes, which they readily compared to Nazi crimes against the Jews. There was, of course, something cruelly paradoxical and indeed paradoxical in demanding the acquittal of a Nazi, the ultimate white supremacist, in the name of oppressed people and peoples of color around the world. But Jacques Vergès understood full well the extent of French discomfort and guilt over its own colonial past, and he intended to capitalize on it. So what could the prosecution do to counter the defense's radical but compelling version of history and the histrionics of Vergès and his colleagues? While in legal terms, Vergès' defense strategy might seem ludicrous, you cannot acquit someone for murder just because someone else committed a similar crime next door and got away. It is important to remember that the Barbie trial played out as well in the court of public opinion, and a global court of public opinion at that. One strategy adopted by civil parties lawyer Serge Klarsfeld is noted was to insist on the number and innocence of some of Barbie's victims, the children of Lisieux. But it fell to chief prosecutor Pierre Truche to come up with a broader strategy intended not only to blunt the disruptive impact of Vergès' courtroom antics, but to counter the vision of history, of historical guilt and innocence Vergès sought to impose on the court. Pierre Truche was up to the task. Calm and modest in demeanor, Truche noted first that Jacques Vergès' historical arguments were less the disruption he intended than simply a diversion, an effort to throw the trial off course forget about the accused, and focused on other past crimes far removed from those committed by Barbie. But underscoring the diversionary tactics of the defense would hardly win the case for the prosecution, and Trusch knew it. What had to be hammered home was that Barbie was indeed responsible for the horrendous crimes described by the victims and expert witnesses at the trial, and that these crimes were indeed crimes against humanity. On the issue of Barbie's responsibility for the crimes at issue, Trusch did what the defense had not. He scrupulously marshaled and examined the evidence against the accused. The most controversial piece of evidence was known as the Isieux telex, the telex Barbie sent to Paris informing his superiors of the arrest of the 43 children and their teachers in the small village of Isieux. Barbie had first claimed that the telex itself was a forgery, then that his signature and handwriting at the bottom of the telex had been added subsequently to frame him. Carefully and methodically, Trusch disproved both claims. Combined with the testimony of victims and expert witnesses, the case against Barbie now seemed overwhelming. But were all the crimes Barbie was charged with crimes against humanity, especially those against resistance fighters? The testimony of Lise Lesèvre and other resistance survivors of Barbie's torture had been compelling, but Trusch nevertheless needed to fit the experience of Jewish deportees and resistance fighters into a single category that fit the definition of the crime while acknowledging crucial distinctions. To do so, Trusch argued that it was at its most fundamental level, a crime against humanity is a plunge into inhumanity. For the Jew, this occurred from the moment of her or his birth, if the world into which he or she was born was controlled by the Nazis. For the resistance fighter, this was not the case, unless, arrested by the Nazis, she or he was sent to a concentration camp, as so many of Barbie's resistance victims had been. The experience of the camp was that resistance fighter's plunge into inhumanity. One could argue that Lise Lesèvre's experiences at Barbie's hands in Lyon was also a crime against humanity. But what she shared with virtually all the other resistance members, as well as Jews arrested by Barbie, was the plunge into inhumanity in the concentration camps from which so few would return. The Barbie trial concluded shortly after midnight on the morning of the 4th of July, 1987. Barbie was found guilty on all charges with no extenuating circumstances. The death penalty had been outlawed in France in the early 1980s, so Barbie was sentenced to life in prison. He died in 1991, and his ashes were scattered in the rivers that flow through Lyon. What is the memory and legacy of the Barbie trial in French and European history, as well as international law? Critics of the trial, like the American journalist Ted Morgan, described the Barbie trial as a quote-unquote necessary travesty because, he said, Barbie's guilt was certain and his conviction a foregone conclusion. But as I hope to have shown here, neither claim proved accurate. In an historic trial like the Barbie trial or the Eichmann trial before it, there are compelling witnesses who bring the past and past traumas to life and help the court to understand the gravity of the crimes of the accused. But there are also unconvincing or problematic witnesses whose testimony, deliberately or not, confuses the court and jury by obscuring rather than clarifying the matters at hand. While this was, in the Barbie trial, several expert witnesses openly disagreed with the definition of crimes against humanity handed down by the French Supreme Court. While this was their prerogative, their testimony certainly did not help the prosecution to make its case. In retrospect, it is to the credit of the Lyon court and the Barbie trial itself that such discordant voices were heard and that the prosecution was nevertheless able to secure Barbie's conviction. On another note, while Jacques Vergès' evocations of French colonial oppression and racism in the former colonies did not sway the verdict, they nevertheless struck a nerve. French guilt over its colonial past was in 1987 and remains today a weight on the French national psyche. Some critics of the trial went so far as to argue that Vergès and his defense team won the case in court of public opinion, despite their defeat in the Lyon courtroom itself. Others, including myself, disagree. Despite Vergès's best efforts, Barbie's crimes and those of his fellow Nazis were not obscured. They did not disappear in an ocean of human suffering. Rather, through the eloquent and moving testimony of women like Lise Lesèvre and Simone Kadosh Lagrange and the efficiency of the prosecution, they remain distinct and unforgettable. What are the legal legacies of the Barbie trial? International law on war crimes and crimes against humanity is extraordinarily complex and often specific to a given national, cultural, or historic context. Still, according to some legal scholars, what the Barbie trial succeeded in accomplishing in a broader global context was to make it possible to expand the definition of crimes against humanity such that it could be applied not simply to non-combatant racial and ethnic minorities, but to other categories of victims as well. Given the nature of many recent conflicts and genocides, this is as it should be. In France, the legal legacies of the Barbie trial have been profound and far-reaching. In the 1990s, as part of the ongoing effort to address its World War II past and crimes committed by Frenchmen in the context of the Holocaust, 2 former Vichy officials, one a member of its paramilitary police and one a highly placed civil servant, were charged with and convicted of crimes against humanity for their wartime actions. Without the precedent and the impetus of the Barbie trial, neither trial would have taken place. In the new century, the efforts of the French legal system to come to terms with mass crimes have shifted focus from World War II to include more recent crimes. In the wake of the 1994 genocide of Rwandan Tutsis by the Hutu majority, many Rwanda Hutu genocidaires escaped to France and Europe. Because of the receptivity of the French legal system to judge such crimes since the Barbie trial, several Hutu killers have been tried and convicted of crimes against humanity, bringing justice for their victims thousands of miles away. As we sit here this evening, a special court in Paris is trying the accomplices of an Islamic terrorist who mowed down hundreds on the esplanade in the Mediterranean city of Nice as they celebrated the French national holiday on 14 July 2016. Last year, a similar court tried multiple Islamic terrorists for the horrendous attacks in November 2015 that killed and maimed hundreds, if not thousands. To be sure, none of these terrorists were tried for crimes against humanity under French law. There is a separate jurisprudence for terrorism in France, a country that more than any other Western European country has fallen victim to Islamic terrorist crimes. But the idea that mass crimes of this nature should be dealt with in a court of law, and that the law must be alive and adaptable in order to bring justice to perpetrators and victims alike, is very much a legacy of the Barbie trial. Indeed, after the conclusion of the Barbie trial, Pierre Truche, the chief prosecutor who did so much to assure Barbie's conviction, argued that one of the lessons of the trial was that the definition of crimes against humanity should not be bound up permanently in a single immutable statute. Rather, it should be, like all human endeavors, a work in progress. In this way, the law and justice remain alive and vibrant. All indicators are that that remains the case in France today. Thank you.
If you have questions, we ask that you, I think you were given a card as you came in. If you would write those down and hand them to the ambassadors, we'll start. While we wait for the cards. I guess my question here is if you could say a little bit more about Klaus Barbie's relationship with American intelligence. And I guess the question here is really on what basis could he have been valuable to them? It's not the case that U.S. intelligence did not have other assets in France.
Right. The attitude of American intelligence generally after the war was that the best people to spy on the communists, that is the Soviet Union, were the Nazis because they had been their enemies. So they prized especially Nazi Gestapo agents and others because they thought they had a special expertise. In Barbie's case, the American intelligence was aware of the fact that he had been in Lyon, even though it was not well known to the public when they first hired him. And because, as I mentioned in my talk, they were worried that French intelligence was infiltrated by communists, which to a certain degree it might well have been, they assigned him to work in the French sector and to spy on the French. I mentioned also that one of the issues with Barbie and with so many of these intelligence operatives that the CIC was who hired Barbie, is there is really no way to check as to whether or not the information that was given to them was accurate or valid or whatever. So there is one argument that these agents were all basically taking advantage of American and other intelligence services. When Barbie got to South America, there are indications that he had some contact with the CIA. Although from the many books I've read about Barbie's life in South America, it's very hard to tell what the specifics of these are, and the documentation is not thorough. Basically, when he was in South America, Barbie was working for South American dictatorships in his role as doing interrogations and repression, as I mentioned.
A question from the audience. Does the altering French courts change in this definition of crimes against humanity, which occurred, I think, while Barbie was already in custody?
Correct.
Was this sort of consistent with French due process?
I've given you, I guess the best way to put this is a very positive read, because I believe that the trial was just, and what happened was important for the French and also for people like Barbie. But the fact of the matter is, anytime you're involved in rewriting the law in the midst of, or changing the law in the midst of a trial or in the midst of an investigation, there's a lot of good reasons to cry foul. And one of the civil parties lawyers, Serge Klarsfeld, who I pointed out defended the children of Lisieux, protested in the newspaper immediately, setting off quite a controversy about whether or not resistance fighters should be included as victims of crimes against humanity. There's a legacy of making these changes that's more problematic than the way I presented it. I mean, I think overall the changes were necessary and helpful. But during the trial of Paul Touvier, one of the Frenchmen tried for crimes against humanity, the decision in the Barbie trial about the definition of crimes against humanity posed very specific problems for that prosecution. So there are legacies, negative legacies as well, to the legal changes that were made in order to prosecute Barbie. But I think it's also important to realize that since Nuremberg, I mean, when crimes against humanity were introduced in Nuremberg and the Nazis were tried, that was already retroactive. So there's a problem with this, and one of the justifications for it is that there were what we think of now and what we define as genocide and crimes against humanity. We simply had not been able to imagine that before the Nazi adventure. And I think that's a pretty valid way to look at it.
Was when the French court changed that definition, was it well understood at the time of when they made the decision change that this was to open up the Barbie case, or was that less clear?
There was a lot of pressure by a lot of high-up people in the resistance, who, by the way, were very important in post-war French governments, to include resistance victims among those that were, victims of crimes against humanity, so that Barbie could be charged with them. Because otherwise, you would have a trial of a man whose most important victim, Jean Moulin, was a resistance fighter, and many of his victims, probably about half, were resistance fighters. So it seemed, from the standpoint of the Supreme Court, I suspect that if we're going to hold a trial, but we're going to leave out, half the victims essentially on a technicality, we need to fix that. Okay. But there is a good deal of in fact, a tremendous amount of public pressure to include some resistance victims in those charges. And as I hope to have shown in discussing the case of Lise LeSèvre, there are a lot of ways of reading what war crimes are, but what happened to her was beyond the pale. It was clearly not a standard war crime. She was a courier. She wasn't even an armed combatant. She was arrested just basically couriering information from one resistance superior to the other. She'd never herself raised arms against the Germans. and yet Barbie tortured her multiple times. And then, as I mentioned, when she wouldn't give away the names of her superiors, she had her son. Barbie had her son and her husband arrested, and both died in deportation. So that's gets a sense of, if that's not a crime against humanity, if you think in broadly human terms, it's hard to imagine what is.
You had mentioned that Klaus Barbie, or people like Klaus Barbie, had been tried once in France in 1952. So why couldn't whatever sentence, whatever verdict had been reached then simply be applied later, since that was in the statute of limitations?
Because he was convicted for war crimes, and so both the statute of limitations and the punishment had run out.
Oh, so it includes the punishment.
Right.
It's not simply getting the
Right.
trial in. Okay.
Yeah.
So that had to be. All right. A question about Jean Moulin, and do you have a theory about how he was betrayed?
There's probably 500 books about that particular topic. I mean,
Okay.
the man who was tried for betraying him was a member of the resistance named René Aldi. And my sense is that Aldi had been essentially arrested and turned by Barbie before he gave away Jean Moulin. So my sense is, until there's better proof that somebody else did it or it happened a different way, I believe that René Aldi, the person who was tried and actually acquitted, was in fact the guilty person. He was acquitted on a technicality. So.
Another question concerns perhaps the lessons from Nuremberg that have been sort of improved with perhaps these legal rulings and these procedures.
Yeah. You mean, are you asking me, did the Barbie decision improve the Nuremberg statutes?
Oh, yeah, perhaps that would be a way to think about it.
I mean, that again depends on how you view crimes against humanity and genocide. I mean, I think Serge Klarsfeld, who's still alive and still militant in pursuit of Nazi criminals, always believed that changing the Nuremberg statute on crimes against humanity or modifying it to include others was a big mistake. Because once you start expanding the categories, then pretty soon what is distinctive about crimes against humanity as defined at Nuremberg loses its specificity. But if you look at, I took the opportunity yesterday to look at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and for the former Yugoslavia to see their definition. And what you see is that the types of crimes included there are changes made to account for crimes that were committed in these specific contexts. So for example, rape, sterilization of women, these were things that certainly did not count as crimes against humanity in any definition imagined at Nuremberg. And yet they're now included, especially, both Rwanda and Yugoslavia for both of those. Because during the Rwandan genocide, in particular, which I know something about because I went with a group of French scholars several years ago to Rwanda, the rape culture was part of the subjugation and murder of the population. That was an integral part of the Hutu attack on the Tutsis. So that's something. Yeah.
Let me get some more questions, but a final one that I have in this set concerns, have you been watching the Ken Burns series on the Holocaust?
I have.
And your opinion?
I think the last two episodes I thought were tremendous. The first one I thought was a little bit confusing to the degree that it situated the Holocaust more in Germany than the United States. But I think in retrospect that was necessary because I'm a Holocaust specialist, so I've seen a lot of these films and it's familiar to me, but for the average American audience member, it's not going to be as familiar. But I think it was a really well done series, like all of his series, just about.
So a question, could you tell us more about sort of what got your interest in Klaus Barbie? I think you've told me a little bit, but
I guess I got interested in World War II in France in a roundabout way. My background is in literature, and I was working on a writer who had collaborated during the war. And I did not know what that meant. So I thought, what is collaboration? And that meant learning about Vichy France, about the defeat of the French in May, June 1940. And then from there, I got very interested in the whole, not only what happened during the wartime years, but the memory of the war, because the memory of the war has continued to haunt the French for a variety of reasons in a lot of ways, all the way up to the present. I mean, the 1990s was dominated to a certain degree by controversies surrounding World War II and its legacies. Some of you may remember that French President François Mitterrand, it came out in the mid-1990s that he'd been given the highest honor by the Vichy regime that could be given. He'd been given the Francis. So here you have a socialist president who's been awarded by Vichy. And this was just one scandal. The other ones were the trials that I mentioned and things like that. So perhaps it's the controversial part of it, but I think more than anything else, it's a discovery that's led me, it's almost like following a mystery. I started with a collaborationist writer, and I ended up finally with a Nazi killer.
Curious question about Klaus Barbie's time in Bolivia. But he made no particular efforts there to hide who he was.
No, he arrived in Bolivia using the name Klaus Altmann. And the irony is that Altmann was the name of the rabbi in the town that he was raised in, and he deliberately chose the rabbi's name. Why? That's a matter of interpretation. But once he was there, he didn't go out of his way to cover himself, but he was operating under the name Altmann, and he ingratiated himself with the Bolivian governments pretty quickly on. Not only that, there's a very large German community of expats in Bolivia as well as in obviously other parts of South America. But he was actually found in the early 1970s. His presence there was discovered by Serge and Beata Klarsfeld, who denounced him to the world, but he was still protected by the dictatorships, and that's when he was happy to announce that he was Klaus Barbie, give interviews and make a lot of money doing it. And it was only when the government changed, so that would be 10 years later, that he actually was expelled from Bolivia. He was not removed. He was expelled by the government.
Okay, so the government asked him to leave, and then who captured him?
Yeah. Well, they had made an agreement with the French government, and what they did is, because in order to expatriate him, there's a problem with that legally in the Bolivian system, so they expelled him, and they made a deal with the French government to fly him to French Guiana, where the French would be waiting to arrest him.
Ah, okay.
There was apparently a fair amount of money exchanged over this. And one of my favorite stories of the Barbie trial is when the plane landed in French Guiana, the pilots realized there was money to be made, and so they refused to open the plane until money was handed to them through the cockpit windows. So they managed to round up enough money to convince the pilots of the plane to open up the plane to let Barbie be arrested.
Mm-hmm. A question here. I mean, as an unrepentant anti-Semite, do you say anything about him choosing to work for a Jewish owner? Was the plan there always?
Barbie claimed in court that once he was in South America, he was in a culture that was completely different, where everybody was accepted. But that's his version. There are a lot of other versions of, anecdotes where, for example, he found out that he thought a particular individual that he was doing business with was Jewish, and he made a point of disrespecting him, of abusing him in public. And then later, when he found out the person wasn't Jewish, he became friends with him. So yeah, and Barbie would get drunk in various bars in Bolivia, and make statements like nobody offends the Fuhrer in my presence. There's a wonderful, for those of you who are very interested in Barbie, there's a great documentary film called Hotel Terminus that won the Academy Award for the best documentary in, I think, 1987 about Klaus Barbie. And the documentary maker traveled to South America and interviewed any number of people, confidants, people who had been his neighbors, things like that. It's a fascinating film. It really is. And for me, that was part of the reason that I started working on this book. Was I was fascinated by the film, and I wanted to write an article about the film. And I said, well, so where's the book on the Barbie trial? And I asked my French historian friend Henry Rousseau, who's a Hagler Fellow here at the Bush School. They said, there is no book on the Barbie trial. So it's you. So that's how I started. The archives also happened to open up right when I became interested in this. So that facilitated things. And Serge Klarsfeld was very generous to me and gave me his personal files from the trial to use, which I had in my possession for about 2 years. They were quite fascinating. It took a lot to figure out how to read a French, legal files. I had to learn a whole new discipline.
We have reached, I believe, not only the end of the questions, but the end of our allotted time. Are there copies of the book available?
On Amazon.
Okay.
Please order.
It looks like this. And thank you very much, Professor Golson.
Thank you. Thanks, David.